Another perfect morning for you. I see, came a gentle voice from below. Clara smiled without opening her eyes. Mrs. Gable, you're up early. From the balcony beneath hers, the elderly widow leaned against her railing, a steaming mug cradled in her hands. Early, my dear. The sun and I have been acquainted for hours. But you, always out here before the city wakes. What is it about these plants that calls to you so? Clara finally opened her eyes, her gaze lingering on the dewdrops clinging to rosemary needles like tiny diamonds. They don't ask for much, she said softly. Just water, a little sun, and patience. And in return, they give everything they have. She carefully pinched a sprig of thyme, crushing it lightly between her fingers before bringing it to her nose. This one remembers every rain it's ever known. You can taste the sky in its leaves. Mrs. Gable chuckled warmly. You talk about herbs like they're old friends. Aren't they? Clara's smile reached her eyes, warm, hazel eyes that held a quiet depth, as if they'd witnessed both sorrow and grace. When my grandmother taught me to garden, she said plants don't lie. They show you exactly who they are. No masks. No pretending. She paused, her voice softening further. In a world that never stops shouting about what we should want, it's a relief to tend to something that simply is. Inside her modest apartment, a space filled not with luxury but with meaning, Clara moved with unhurried grace. Sunlight danced across worn floorboards, illuminating shelves lined with books whose spines were softened by frequent reading. On the mantelpiece, an arrangement of ordinary stones caught the light river-smoothed granite, a piece of milky quartz veined with gold, a dark basalt worn by centuries of ocean tides. Each had been collected on solitary walks through parks and along forgotten trails, treasures most would overlook. Later that afternoon, as she walked through a nearby park, Clara paused by the creek that wound through the greenery. Kneeling at its edge, she let her fingers trail in the cool water, watching minnows dart between sun-dappled stones. Her hand closed around something smooth and cool, a flat piece of slate, its surface etched with delicate lines like a map of some ancient, forgotten place. She held it to her chest for a moment, feeling its weight, not heavy but present. Real. Another one for the collection, a young boy asked, stopping his bicycle nearby. His curiosity was unguarded, pure. Clara nodded, offering him a gentle smile. This one has stories in its lines. See how the water carved these patterns over hundreds of years. It's been patient. It's been shaped by time, not force. The boy squinted at the stone in her palm. But it's just a rock. To some, Clara agreed softly. But to others, it's a reminder that beauty doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and you have to be quiet enough to hear it. As she continued her walk home, the stone warm in her pocket, Clara felt a familiar ache, not of sadness, but of longing. A longing for connection that went beyond surface and show. She thought of Ricardo, her husband of 8 years, who had just returned from a business trip last night. He'd kissed her forehead distractedly before opening his laptop, murmuring something about big deals and important clients. He'd brought her no gift, not that she'd expected one. But sometimes, in the quiet spaces between them, she wondered if he even noticed the garden she tended, the stones she collected, the woman she truly was beneath the roles of wife and homemaker. That evening, as rain began to patter against the windows, Clara lit a single candle and sat by her balcony doors, watching the city lights blur through the wet glass. She held the new slate stone in her palm, tracing its grooves with her thumb. "You're enough," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible over the rain's gentle rhythm. "Just as you are. Quiet, steady, real." In that moment, Clara wasn't thinking about diamonds or status or the glittering world her husband moved through. She was simply present, with the scent of wet earth rising from her planters, the warmth of the candle flickering across her face, the solid weight of a stone that had survived centuries of change. She felt a deep, unshakable truth settle in her bones that a life built on authenticity might not sparkle under showroom lights, but it would hold you steady when storms came. And storms, she sensed without knowing why, were gathering on the horizon. But for now, for this one fragile, perfect evening, there was only peace. The kind that comes not from having everything, but from needing very little. And as the rain softened to a drizzle outside, Clara closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for tonight, that love built on such quiet foundations could weather anything. Certo. Agora atue como narrador e storyteller, desenvolva a história sem marcações com o nome de cada tópico que for desenvolve. Me conte sobre o tópico 2 com diálogo como se eu fosse o espectador, sempre lembrando de desenvolver com muita emoção. com muitos sentimentos de forma que a estrutura da narrativa utiliza uma linha temporal linear de modo o espectador sentir o que o personagem está sentindo em inglês. Com 6.000 caracteres, pensamento concluído, depentou-se elevador doors lid open. With a whisper, revealing Ricardo before he even stepped fully into view. The sharp line of his tailored navy suit, the confident set of his shoulders, the way his polished Oxford shoes caught the light as he strode into the apartment without removing his sunglasses. At 39, Ricardo carried himself like a man who had never been told no, his handsome face sculpted by privilege and polished by years of closing deals in rooms where champagne flowed like water. Clara, his voice echoed through the open-plan space, not unkindly, but with the distracted tone of someone checking a box on a mental to-do list. You hear she emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a simple cotton apron. I'm here. Dinner's almost ready. Ricardo dropped his briefcase onto the marble console with a thud that made her flinch slightly. He finally removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes the color of dark honey. Beautiful, but rarely soft when they looked at her anymore. He pressed a quick kiss to her cheek, his lips cool against her skin, already turning toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering cityscape below. Long day, he murmured, loosening his tie with practiced ease. Closed the Kensington deal. 6 figures. Again. He said it not as sharing, but as announcement, like a king declaring a victory to his court. Clara moved to the stove, stirring a pot of vegetable soup. That's wonderful, Ricardo. I made your favorite, rosemary bread to go with it. He barely glanced toward the kitchen. Actually, I had a working dinner at Le Bernardin. Oysters, truffle pasta. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. But I'll eat something. Can't let your efforts go to waste. The words landed softly but cut deeply. Can't let your efforts go to waste. As if her cooking were a charitable project rather than an act of love. Later, as they sat at the minimalist dining table, Clara in her simple linen dress, Ricardo still in his suit jacket, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and slid it toward her. Almost forgot. Saw this today. Thought of you. Clara's heart did that foolish, hopeful leap it still attempted after 8 years. She opened the box slowly. Inside lay a pair of pearl earrings. Elegant, expensive, utterly impersonal. They're beautiful, she said truthfully, though her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted one. But Ricardo, my ears aren't pierced. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Gone in an instant, replaced by practiced charm. Right. Well, we'll get that done. A woman in your position should have pierced ears anyway. He took a sip of wine. Vanessa, my assistant, helped me pick them out. She has excellent taste. Vanessa. The name hung in the air between them, delicate as smoke but heavy with implication. Clara had never met this Vanessa, but she'd become a ghost in their marriage. A presence felt in the late nights at the office, the perfume that sometimes clung to Ricardo's collar, jasmine and ambition. The way he'd started using phrases like a woman in your position as if Clara were an accessory to his success rather than its witness. I don't need pierced ears, Clara said softly, closing the box. And I don't need pearls. You know what I love? Ricardo's smile tightened at the edges. Stones from creek beds and herbs that smell like medicine. Clara, be reasonable. This is what people expect. When I take you to the Henderson Gala next month, you'll wear these. People will see you're taken care of. Taken care of, she repeated, the words tasting like ash. Is that what we're doing here, performing taken care of for an audience that doesn't know us for the first time that evening? Ricardo truly looked at her. Really looked. And what he saw seemed to confuse him. The woman who had once laughed freely at his jokes, who had stayed up with him during his first startup failure, holding his hand as he cried into her shoulder. She was still there, but a distance had grown between them like ivy on a wall, slow, persistent, separating what had once been connected. You're being dramatic, he said finally, his voice losing its polished edge, revealing the tired man beneath. I work 80 hours a week to give us this life. The penthouse, the cars, the security. What more do you want? Clara stood and walked to the balcony doors, her reflection ghostly against the city lights. I want you to ask me about my day before you tell me about yours. I want you to remember that I hate oysters because they remind me of my father's funeral. I want you to see that the stone I placed on your desk last week, the one with the quartz veins, was from the creek where we had our first picnic. Her voice broke just once. I want to be known, Ricardo. Not kept. He stared at her back, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the bedroom. You have everything most women dream of, he said without turning. Sometimes I wonder if you even know how lucky you are. After he closed the bedroom door, gently, never slamming, because slamming would be undignified, Clara remained by the window. Below, the city pulsed with life, couples laughing on restaurant patios, friends toasting on rooftops, strangers connecting under streetlights. Everywhere, people reaching for each other. She thought of the pearl earrings in their velvet prison. Beautiful, cold, meaningless. And she thought of the smooth river stone in her pocket, the one she'd picked up that afternoon, its surface warmed by her touch. Imperfect, unpolished, real. In the silence of the penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home, Clara made a quiet promise to herself she would no longer confuse being adorned with being loved. She would no longer mistake expensive gestures for emotional presence. And she would remember, truly remember, that a heart cannot be fed with diamonds when it is starving for attention. Outside, a single star pierced the urban haze. Clara pressed her palm against the cool glass, imagining its ancient light traveling centuries just to reach her eyes tonight. Some things, she realized, were meant to be witnessed. Not owned, not displayed, not used as proof of status. Simply witnessed. And cherished. But Ricardo, already asleep in their king-sized bed, dreamed only of closing bigger deals, acquiring shinier objects, and building a life that looked perfect from the outside. Never realizing that the most valuable thing he possessed was precise script. She traced the words with her finger, noticing how the pen had pressed harder on the word important, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. By evening, rain began to fall, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the city lights into watercolor smudges against the darkening sky. Clara had just finished watering her balcony garden when Ricardo's key turned in the lock. He entered not with his usual confident stride, but with a strange, buoyant energy that made her pause, trowel still in hand. "Long day?" she asked, wiping soil from her fingers onto her apron. "The longest," he said, but his smile was different, lighter, almost giddy. He placed his briefcase down with unusual care, then reached into his coat pocket. But productive. Clara watched as he withdrew not one, but two small boxes. Her breath caught, not with hope, but with a sudden, chilling intuition. The larger box was wrapped in deep blue paper, tied with silver ribbon. The smaller one was plain brown paper, folded neatly but without flourish. He handed her the brown package first. "For you. Saw these today and thought of your little garden project." She took it slowly, the paper rough against her palms. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, lay 5 ordinary river stones, smooth gray, utterly unremarkable. One was slightly larger than the others, with a faint white streak running through its center. "They're stones," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Ricardo's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Unique ones. The jeweler had them in a display case next to the gems. Said they were from some ancient riverbed. Millions of years old." He chuckled, a sound that scraped against her nerves. "Figured they were perfect for you. So natural. Unpolished. Just like you've always preferred." Clara's fingers tightened around the stones. They felt heavy suddenly, not with geological age, but with meaning. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "You bought these at a jeweler's. Vanessa spotted them," he said casually, already turning toward the bedroom with the blue-wrapped box. "Said they had character. Unlike most rocks." The name again. Vanessa. And now, a detail that landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. A jeweler. Not a gift shop. Not a garden center. A jeweler. "Ricardo," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why were you at a jeweler today?" He paused in the doorway, the blue box cradled in his hands like something sacred. For a heartbeat, she saw it, the flicker of calculation behind his eyes. The choice between truth and performance. He chose performance. "Client appreciation," he said smoothly. "Had to pick up something for Henderson's wife. You know how these things go." He didn't look at her as he spoke. His gaze remained fixed on the hallway mirror, adjusting his cufflinks with unnecessary precision. But Clara had learned to read the spaces between his words, the silences where truth used to live. She remembered the pearl earrings he'd claimed Vanessa helped select, the jasmine scent on his collar last Tuesday, the way he'd started checking his phone face down during dinner. "Let me see what you got for Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Ricardo's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "It's nothing special. Just please." With a sigh that carried the weight of indulging a child's curiosity, he turned and placed the blue box on the kitchen island between them. The ribbon slipped away with a whisper. Inside, resting on black velvet, lay a necklace that stole the breath from Clara's lungs. A single teardrop diamond, flawless, ice-white, catching the overhead light and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows across the marble surface. It was exquisite. It was everything she'd never wanted. And it was unmistakably not for any client's wife. Clara's vision blurred. Not with tears yet, but with the sudden, violent clarity of understanding. The stones in her hand weren't a gift. They were a message. A hierarchy made tangible diamonds for the woman who mattered, rocks for the woman who remained. "You bought this for Vanessa," she said. It wasn't a question. Ricardo's mask slipped then, not into guilt, but into irritation. The polished executive vanished, revealing the impatient boy beneath who hated being caught. "What does it matter? It's just jewelry." Just jewelry. Clara's laugh was a fragile, broken thing. She held up the river stones, their dull surfaces absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. "You gave me stones from a jeweler's case while buying diamonds for your mistress. And you think the difference is just jewelry?" His face hardened. "Don't be dramatic. You have everything you need here. Security. Comfort. A life most women would kill for." He gestured around the penthouse, the cold marble, the silent rooms, the view that cost more than most people's homes. While she understands ambition. She appreciates what I'm building. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Clara looked down at the stones in her palm, the one with the white streak catching a stray beam of city light, revealing unexpected depth within its grayness. She thought of the creek where she'd dreamed of finding such stones herself, of picnics with a younger Ricardo who'd held her hand and called her his compass. And she understood then, not just about Vanessa, not just about the diamonds, but about the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of their marriage. Ricardo believed love was transactional. He provided luxury. She provided, what decorum? Silence, a respectable presence on his arm. He'd never understood that Clara's wealth wasn't in bank accounts or property deeds. It was in her capacity to see beauty in what others discarded, to find value where others saw worthlessness, to love not for what someone had, but for who they were. "You think these stones are worthless," she said softly, closing her fingers around them. "But they've witnessed centuries of rain. They've been shaped by forces you can't control. They don't need to glitter to be real." She looked up, her eyes clear now, dry and steady. "You can keep your diamonds, Ricardo. Give them to whoever makes you feel important. But don't ever again pretend that what you offer is love." She turned and walked toward the balcony, the stones warm against her skin. Behind her, she heard him open his mouth, to argue, to justify, to perform, but no words came. Only the sound of the rain and the soft click of the bedroom door closing behind him. Alone on the balcony, Clara pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The city stretched below her, glittering with 1,000,000 artificial stars, diamonds on every finger, every neck, every wrist. And for the first time, she didn't feel small beneath that glittering sky. She felt awake. The stones in her hand weren't an insult. They were a revelation. They showed her exactly who Ricardo had become, and in doing so, reminded her of who she had always been. Not a woman to be adorned, not a possession to be displayed, but a woman of substance, of depth, of quiet, unshakable worth. She didn't cry that night. Instead, she sat on the balcony floor as the rain softened to a mist, tracing the white streak in the largest stone with her thumb. And deep within her, something shifted. Not with violence, but with the gentle, inevitable certainty of a river stone turning over in the current. The marriage was over. Not because of Vanessa, not because of diamonds, but because love cannot survive when one person sees the other as decoration rather than destination. And as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold, Clara made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a homecoming. She would no longer live in the shadow of someone else's ambitions. Her mind traveled backward. Not in regret, but in remembrance. To a sun-drenched afternoon 8 years ago, when she'd stood in her grandmother's study surrounded by the scent of old books and lemon polish, signing papers that would change everything. "You're certain about this?" my love Abuela Elena had asked, her silver hair catching the Andalusian sun streaming through the arched windows. The woman who had built Verde Vida from a single olive grove into an empire of sustainable agriculture now looked at her granddaughter not as an heir, but as a fragile hope. Clara had nodded, her signature flowing across the legal documents with a certainty that belied the tremor in her hands. "I need to know if he loves me, Abuela. Not the name, not the fortune, just me. And so she'd done it. At 26, Clara Mendez, the sole heir to Verde Vita's thousands of acres, its innovative water conservation systems, its global distribution network, had vanished. In her place emerged Clara Silva, a woman of modest means who worked part-time at a botanical garden, who lived in a sunlit apartment with peeling paint but a glorious balcony garden, who carried her wealth not in bank statements but in the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own worth. She'd met Ricardo at a farmer's market, of all places. He'd been arguing with a vendor about the price of heirloom tomatoes, his tie slightly askew, his frustration endearing in its authenticity. When he'd turned and collided with her basket of fresh herbs, sending rosemary sprigs scattering across the cobblestones, he dropped to his knees without hesitation to gather them. "I'm so sorry," he'd said, his eyes meeting hers, truly meeting them, for the first time. "I was so busy calculating profit margins I forgot to look where I was going." Clara had laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even her. Profit margins don't matter when you're holding rosemary. It's meant to be smelled, not sold. He'd inhaled deeply, closing his eyes. "You're right. It smells like childhood, like my grandmother's kitchen." In that moment, she'd seen not the ambitious executive he would become, but the boy beneath, the one who still carried memories of simple joys. And she'd fallen not for his potential wealth, but for that glimpse of authenticity. Their early days had been built on such moments. Picnics with cheese bought from street vendors, walks through parks where he'd actually put his phone away, nights spent talking until dawn about dreams that had nothing to do with stock portfolios. He'd loved her collection of ordinary stones then, had even started his own small pouch of Clara's rocks, carrying them in his pocket, as good luck charms during his first nerve-wracking investor meetings. "You ground me," he'd told her once, pressing a smooth gray stone into her hand after closing his first major deal. "When everything feels like smoke and mirrors, I touch this and remember what's real." But somewhere along the way, after the third successful venture, the penthouse upgrade, the country club membership, the smoke and mirrors had become his reality. And Clara, with her herbs and stones and quiet ways, had become an artifact from a simpler time he no longer wished to remember. Now, sitting on the cold balcony floor as morning fully arrived, Clara's fingers traced the white vein in the river stone. She thought of the documents locked in her safety deposit box downtown, the ones Ricardo had never seen, the ones that revealed her true identity not as Clara Silva, botanical assistant, but as Clara Mendez, controlling shareholder of Verde Vita, worth hundreds of millions. Not in flashy assets, but in fertile earth, in ancient olive groves, in water rights that would become more valuable than diamonds as the climate shifted. She'd hidden it all not out of deception, but out of hope. The hope that love could exist without calculation. That a man might choose her for her laughter, her patience with basil plants, her ability to find beauty in rain-washed stones. She'd wanted to be wanted, not for what she could provide, but for who she was. A soft chime broke the silence, the building's service elevator announcing a delivery. Clara rose stiffly, her legs protesting the long night vigil. At the door stood Miguel, the elderly doorman who had watched her come and go for 8 years, who always saved the plumpest tomatoes from his wife's garden for her. "Buen dia, Señora Clara," he said gently, holding out a small envelope. "This came yesterday. I kept it at the desk since the señor was traveling." His eyes held a quiet knowing. Miguel saw everything in this building, but he guarded secrets like sacred things. Inside the envelope, a single sheet of thick cotton paper bore her grandmother's elegant script, "My dearest Clara, the olive harvest begins next week. The groves miss your hands. So do I. Remember what I taught you: the deepest roots grow in silence. They do not announce themselves to the wind. They simply hold. Come home when you are ready. The earth always welcomes those who remember how to listen. With all my love." Abuela Clara's breath caught. Abuela had never once questioned her choice to hide her inheritance. She'd simply waited, like the ancient olive trees themselves, patient, enduring, certain that truth would find its season. Later that morning, as Ricardo emerged from the bedroom freshly showered and already on a conference call. "Yes, the Q3 projections look strong, absolutely." Clara stood at the kitchen island preparing tea. She moved with a new stillness, as if something fundamental had settled within her overnight. He ended the call and approached, his expression carefully neutral. "We should talk about last night." Clara poured hot water over chamomile blossoms, watching them swirl and open like tiny suns. "Should we? I was stressed," he began, the rehearsed words smooth as glass. "The Henderson deal is complicated. Vanessa is just efficient. She helps me stay organized. Is that what we're calling it now? Clara's voice remained calm, but beneath it ran a current of something new. Not anger, but clarity. Efficiency, Ricardo sighed, running a hand through his hair in the gesture she'd once found endearing. What do you want me to say, Clara? That I made a mistake? Fine. I made a mistake. But we have a life here. A good life. Don't throw it away over stones, she finished softly, turning to face him. She held up the river stone, its white vein catching the morning light. You see this streak? Geologists call it a mineral intrusion. Something foreign forced its way into the stone's core millions of years ago. The stone didn't reject it. It absorbed it, transformed it into part of its beauty. She stepped closer, close enough to see the faint pulse in his throat. You think you gave me an insult last night, but you gave me a gift. You showed me exactly who you've become. And in doing so, you reminded me of who I am. Ricardo stared at her, his confidence faltering for the first time. This wasn't the reaction he'd anticipated. The tears, the accusations, the desperate clinging to their gilded cage. This calm certainty unnerved him more than any outburst could. Who you are, he echoed, a note of genuine confusion in his voice. You're my wife. You live in this penthouse because of what I've built. Clara smiled then, not a sad smile, but one touched with genuine pity. No, Ricardo. I live in this penthouse because I chose to. And soon I won't anymore. She turned back to her tea, the steam warming her face. You asked what I want. I want to walk through olive groves at dawn. I want to feel soil under my fingernails that hasn't been sterilized by landscapers. I want to be with someone who sees the universe in a river stone, not because it's valuable, but because it's survived. Ricardo stood frozen in the center of their perfect kitchen, surrounded by everything money could buy, yet suddenly feeling poorer than he ever had in his life. He saw it then, the shift in her posture, the light in her eyes that no longer sought his approval. Clara wasn't breaking. She was remembering. And in that remembering, she was becoming someone he no longer recognized, and someone he feared he could never possess again. As he retreated to his study without another word, Clara lifted her teacup to her lips. The chamomile tasted of sun and patience. And for the first time in years, she felt not the weight of secrets, but the lightness of truth waiting to be spoken. The S avoiding Clara's with a precision that felt rehearsed. He brought home expensive pastries from the French bakery she'd once loved, placed them on the marble counter without a word, then retreated to his study where the soft glow of his laptop screen painted his face in shades of blue long after midnight. Clara accepted the pastries with quiet thanks, but didn't eat them. Instead, she carried them downstairs each morning to Miguel, the doorman, who accepted them with a knowing nod and a murmured, "Obrigada, senora. Minha esposa adora." On the third evening, Ricardo left for what he called a critical client dinner. Tie perfectly knotted, cologne lingering in the elevator shaft long after the doors closed. Clara stood alone in the silent apartment, the city lights glittering below like scattered diamonds. She should have felt relief at his absence. Instead, a hollow ache pulsed beneath her ribs. A need to understand not just what he'd done, but how he saw her. The stones had been one thing, but the casual cruelty in his eyes when he'd called her unpolished, that demanded witness. She never would have looked. Not in another life. But something had shifted in her during those dawn hours on the balcony. The understanding that love built on lies was not love at all, but slow suffocation. And suffocating people have a right to air. His laptop sat open on the desk, password protected. But his phone, his sleek silver phone, lay charging on the nightstand, screen dark. A betrayal of its own kind carelessness. Contempt. The assumption that she would never dare. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. The screen brightened to life, no passcode. Of course not, she thought with a bitter twist in her chest. Why would he lock it? She's just the quiet wife who collects stones. Harmless. Invisible. A new message notification glowed at the top of the screen. From Vanessa. Clara's breath hitched. She shouldn't. Every moral fiber screamed at her to put the phone down, to preserve the last shreds of dignity. But dignity felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. Truth was the only currency left. She tapped the message. Vanessa's still thinking about tonight. That necklace is even more stunning in person. Gemstone, Ricardo told you it would suit you. Unlike my wife's taste, she'd probably try to plant it in her herb garden. A coldness spread through Clara's veins, slow and absolute. She scrolled up, her thumb moving as if guided by some force beyond her control. Vanessa, how do you stand living with someone so dim, no sparkle at all? Ricardo, she serves a purpose. Keeps the home front quiet while I build our future. But God, sometimes I look at her tending those plants and wonder if she even knows what ambition feels like. Like watching moss grow. Vanessa Moss doesn't pay the bills. Diamonds do. Winking face Ricardo, exactly. She's a good woman in her way, loyal, simple. But you understand what it means to shine. To be seen. Clara's vision blurred. Not with tears yet. The shock was too deep for tears, but with a white-hot clarity that burned away every illusion she'd clung to. Simple. Dim moss. The words weren't just insults. They were erasure. He hadn't just stopped loving her. He had stopped seeing her. The woman who had stayed up with him during his first business failure, who had sold her grandmother's pearl necklace to cover his rent when investors pulled out, who had believed in him when no one else did. She had been reduced to moss. Something quiet. Something green. Something to be stepped over on the way to brighter things. Her thumb scrolled further, deeper into the archive of their intimacy. Vanessa, what would you do if she found out about us? Ricardo, she wouldn't leave. Women like her don't have options. No career, no family money, no real identity beyond being my wife. She'd rather have a gilded cage than no cage at all. The phone slipped from Clara's hand, clattering onto the duvet. She pressed both palms against her mouth, swallowing a sound that was neither sob nor scream but something primal. The death rattle of a dream she'd nurtured for 8 years. No family money. The irony was a knife twisting deeper. He thought her powerless because he believed her poor. He'd built his contempt on a foundation of lies she herself had constructed. And now that foundation was collapsing beneath them both. A soft chime echoed through the silent apartment. Another message. Vanessa, speaking of cages. When are you finally leaving her? I'm tired of hiding. Ricardo, soon. After the Henderson deal closes next month. I'll make sure she's taken care of financially. But she'll never understand why. Women like her, they think love is forever. Cute, really. Clara stood abruptly, her legs unsteady. She walked to the balcony, the cool night air a shock against her fevered skin. Below, the city pulsed with life. Cars flowing like liquid light, skyscrapers blazing with ambition. And in one of those towers, a woman named Vanessa was trying on a diamond necklace bought with money Clara's own family's earth had helped generate. A necklace meant to symbolize a future built on the ashes of Clara's dignity. She thought of Abuela's letter. The deepest roots grow in silence. But silence had become complicity. Back inside, she retrieved Ricardo's phone. Her hands no longer trembled. With deliberate calm, she opened his email app. No password there either. Arrogance layered upon arrogance. And found the thread with his lawyer. Subject line: divorce strategy, confidential. She didn't read it all. She didn't need to. One sentence seared itself into her memory. Given Clara's lack of independent assets or earning capacity, we can reasonably expect her to accept a modest settlement to avoid prolonged litigation. Modest settlement. As if her years of emotional labor, her quiet support, her very selfhood could be reduced to a number on a check. As if the woman who had chosen love over legacy could be discarded like yesterday's newspaper. A strange calm settled over her then. Not peace, but purpose. The kind that comes when the ground finally stops shaking and you realize you're standing on bedrock. When Ricardo's key turned in the lock 2 hours later, Clara was seated at the kitchen island, his phone placed precisely in the center of the marble surface. She wore no makeup, her hair loose around her shoulders, a simple linen dress she'd bought at a street market their first year together. She looked, he would think later, exactly like herself. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. He froze in the doorway, his gaze darting from her face to the phone. The color drained from his cheeks. Clara, he began, his voice carefully neutral. What are you? I read your messages, she said. Her voice was quiet, but carried through the apartment like a bell. All of them. Ricardo's jaw tightened. He crossed the room in 3 strides and snatched up the phone, his knuckles white. That was a violation of my privacy. Privacy. A soft, broken laugh escaped her. You called me Moss, Ricardo. You told her I have no sparkle. That I'm simple. That I'd never leave because I have nowhere to go. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding his with a steadiness that made him flinch. But here's what you don't know. Moss survives nuclear winters. It grows on stone where nothing else can take root. It doesn't need sparkle to endure. He stared at her, confusion warring with anger in his eyes. What are you talking about? Clara stood slowly, her movements fluid and certain. She walked to the balcony doors and gazed out at the glittering city, the same view he'd bought to prove his success. You think diamonds are rare, she said without turning. but they're just carbon under pressure. Common elements forced into brilliance by violence. She turned then, her face illuminated by the city's false stars. Stones like the ones you gave me, they're formed by time. By water. By patience. They don't need to be cut to be beautiful. They simply are. Ricardo took a step toward her, his voice dropping to a conciliatory tone. Clara, listen. I was stressed. Vanessa. She's a complication, not a replacement. We can fix this. I'll end it. We'll go to counseling. No, she said softly. The word hung in the air, final as a closing door. You don't get to fix this. Because you never saw there was anything broken until I stopped pretending to be the woman you wanted. She walked past him toward the bedroom, her footsteps silent on the marble. At the doorway, she paused. I'm leaving tomorrow. Not because of Vanessa. Because of the man who looks at his wife and sees moss instead of a forest. Where will you go, he demanded, his voice cracking with something like fear. You have no money, Clara. No safety net. You'll be nothing. For the first time, Clara smiled, a real smile, touched with sorrow but unbroken. You've spent 8 years believing I'm nothing, she said. Imagine your surprise when you discover I am everything. She closed the bedroom door gently behind her. Not a slam. Not a dramatic exit. Just a quiet closing of one chapter. Alone in the living room, Ricardo stood frozen, the city lights reflecting in his wide eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. Not as the successful executive, the provider, the man with the perfect life, but as something smaller. Something fragile. Something capable of losing everything without even realizing what he'd had. And in the bedroom, Clara packed a single suitcase. Not with expensive dresses or jewelry, but with her grandmother's letters, her collection of river stones wrapped in soft cloth, and a photograph of herself as a girl, standing barefoot in an olive grove, dirt on her knees and sun in her hair. The girl who knew her worth wasn't measured in carats, but in character. Tomorrow she would call Abuela. Tomorrow she would board a flight south. Tomorrow the real work would begin, not of revenge, but of remembering. Of returning to the earth that had always been her true inheritance. But tonight, she sat on the edge of the bed she would never share with him again, the weight of the river stone she'd placed beneath her pillow, a talisman of truth. She dressed slowly, linen trousers the color of dried sage, a simple cotton blouse, flat leather sandals worn soft by years of walking. No jewelry, no perfume, just herself, unadorned and unafraid. In the kitchen, Ricardo stood by the espresso machine, his back rigid. He hadn't slept. Dark smudges shadowed his eyes, and his tie hung loose around his neck. A man who had spent the night negotiating with his own conscience and losing. You're really doing this, he said without turning. Not a question. An accusation wrapped in disbelief. Clara filled the kettle, the sound of running water a gentle counterpoint to the tension thickening the air. I already did it, Ricardo. Last night, when I chose to see you clearly. He finally faced her, his expression a battlefield of pride and panic. We can fix this. I'll end things with Vanessa today. I'll book us that trip to Tuscany you've always wanted. Stop. The word was soft but absolute, like a stone dropped into still water. Clara turned off the tap and faced him fully. You keep offering me things. Trips. Jewelry. Apologies wrapped in transactions. But you've never once asked what I need. What do you need? He challenged, voice cracking. Tell me. Name it. She took a slow breath, her gaze steady on his. I need you to understand that I'm leaving not because you gave diamonds to another woman. I'm leaving because you looked at me, the woman who held your hand through your first bankruptcy, who believed in you when no one else did, and saw someone you could discard without consequence. Her voice softened, not with forgiveness, but with finality. You thought I had nowhere to go. That's the real betrayal. Not the affair. The contempt. Ricardo flinched as if struck. For the first time, the polished armor cracked, revealing the frightened boy beneath. The one who equated love with possession, worth with wealth. I never meant, I know, Clara interrupted gently. That's what makes it so sad. You never meant to hurt me. You simply stopped seeing me as someone who could be hurt. She lifted her suitcase, lighter than she expected, as if shedding his expectations had lifted a physical weight. At the door she paused, not for dramatic effect, but because some truths deserve witnesses. I won't fight you for this apartment, she said. Or the cars. Or any of it. Keep it all. But know this, you're not keeping me. And one day you'll understand the difference. She closed the door behind her without looking back. Not with a slam, but with the quiet click of a chapter ending. The elevator descended slowly, each floor a layer of her old life peeling away. In the lobby, Miguel stood by the concierge desk, his weathered face etched with quiet concern. Without a word, he handed her a small paper bag. "Fresh bread from my wife's oven," he murmured in Portuguese. For the journey. Clara's eyes welled, not with sadness, but with the profound relief of being seen by someone who asked for nothing in return. "Obrigada, Miguel. For everything." "Semper," he whispered. "Always." Outside, the city roared with its usual indifference. Taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, a world oblivious to the quiet earthquake that had just reshaped one woman's universe. Clara walked 20 blocks to a discreet brownstone in a quieter neighborhood, her suitcase rolling softly behind her. She didn't call a car. She needed to feel the pavement beneath her feet, to remember her own strength with every step. The office door bore only a small brass plaque: Elena Vargas, ESQ, no flashy logo. No receptionist. Just a sanctuary for those who valued discretion over drama. Inside, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held the calm of deep water rose from behind a desk cluttered with legal texts and potted ferns. She didn't smile. She simply opened her arms. "Clara," Abuela's oldest friend murmured, embracing her tightly. "I've been expecting you." Over steaming cups of yerba mate, Clara spoke, not in accusations but in facts. The stones. The messages. The casual cruelty disguised as generosity. Elena listened without interruption, her pen moving across a notepad with the quiet certainty of someone who had navigated these waters before. When Clara finished, Elena set down her pen. "You want revenge? No," Clara said without hesitation. "I want respect. For myself. For the woman I was before I became his accessory." Elena nodded slowly. "Then we proceed with dignity. I've already prepared the initial filing. We'll request a fair division of marital assets. Nothing excessive, nothing punitive. But we will not accept modest settlement, as your lawyer suggested in his emails." A faint smile touched her lips. "He doesn't know I've represented your family for 40 years. Does he?" Clara shook her head, a flicker of something like hope warming her chest. "He thinks I'm powerless." "He thinks you're poor," Elena corrected gently. "There's a difference. And soon, he'll learn which one matters more." She slid a document across the desk. A non-disclosure agreement with a trusted forensic accountant. "We'll need to verify the full extent of marital assets." Quietly. "No drama. No headlines. This isn't about humiliating him, Clara. It's about ensuring you walk away whole." Clara signed without reading the fine print. Trust, she was learning, wasn't dead, just misplaced. Later, sitting on a park bench with Miguel's bread still warm in her hands, Clara watched children chasing pigeons across the grass. A little girl in a yellow dress stumbled, scraping her knee. Instead of crying, she looked at the blood with fascination, then pressed a dandelion against the wound like a bandage. "Does it hurt?" Clara asked softly, moving to sit beside her. The girl shook her head, her eyes wide. "It's just a scratch. My abuela says scratches mean you're growing." Clara's breath caught. "Scratches mean you're growing." She bought the girl an ice cream cone from a nearby vendor, watching as the child's face transformed with simple joy. No diamonds required. No performance. Just sweetness freely given. As dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and rose, Clara boarded a train heading south. Not to Abuela's estate yet, but to a small coastal town where Verde Vida maintained a research station on sustainable aquaculture. A place no one would look for her. A place where the sea air smelled of salt and possibility. In her hotel room that night, a simple space with whitewashed walls and a window. Overlooking the ocean, Clara unpacked her stones one by one, arranging them on the windowsill where the moonlight could touch them. She placed the river stone with the white vein in the center, its quiet beauty a testament to endurance. Her phone buzzed, a text from Ricardo. "Where are you? We need to talk." "This is childish." Clara typed a single reply, her fingers steady. "I am exactly where I need to be." She powered off the phone and placed it in a drawer. For the first time in 8 years, she was unreachable. And in that unreachability, she found not isolation, but freedom. Stepping onto the small balcony, she breathed in the sea air, feeling the salt mist kiss her skin. Below, waves crashed against ancient rocks, patient, persistent, carving beauty from stone over centuries. Not through force, through presence, through time. She thought of the divorce proceedings ahead, the legal battles, the moment Ricardo would learn the truth about her inheritance, not as a weapon, but as a quiet fact stated in a courtroom. She felt no thrill at the thought of his shock. Only a deep, abiding sorrow for the man who had valued glitter over grit, diamonds over depth. But beneath the sorrow ran a stronger current anticipation. Not for revenge, but for rebirth. For mornings spent walking through olive groves instead of marble-floored penthouses. For conversations that didn't revolve around stock prices. For love that saw her, not as decoration but as destination. A shooting star streaked across the darkening sky. Clara made no wish. She simply watched it burn, a brief, brilliant arc of light against the vastness. Like her marriage, beautiful while it lasted, but never meant to endure. She turned back toward her room, toward the stones glowing softly in the moonlight, toward the woman she was becoming, not through destruction, but through remembrance. Not by taking from Ricardo, but by reclaiming herself. The sea whispered against the shore, a rhythm older than diamonds, older than empires. And Clara, standing barefoot on the cool tiles, finally understood some shoulders had straightened, not with defiance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. In her hand, she carried not a designer purse, but a simple leather satchel containing a single river stone wrapped in cloth, her anchor. Inside courtroom 4B, the air smelled of old wood and lemon-scented polish. Ricardo sat at the opposing table already, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He didn't look at her when she entered. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks with theatrical precision, his lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Croft, leaning close to whisper something that made Ricardo smirk. "Mrs. Silva," the judge began, her voice measured and calm. "Mr. Silva, this preliminary hearing will address temporary asset division and living arrangements pending final settlement. Mr. Croft, you may proceed." Croft rose, smoothing his lapels. "Your Honor, my client has been the sole financial provider throughout this 8-year marriage. Mrs. Silva has no independent income, no career trajectory, and frankly, no marketable skills beyond gardening." He let the word hang in the air like an insult. "We request she receive a modest monthly stipend, sufficient for a comfortable apartment in a mid-tier neighborhood, and relinquish all claims to the penthouse, vehicles, and investment portfolio." Clara's lawyer, Elena, remained seated, her hands folded calmly on the table. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited, her gaze steady on the judge. Ricardo finally turned to look at Clara then, not with anger, but with a condescending pity that cut deeper than rage ever could. "Clara," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "be reasonable. You'll have security, comfort. Isn't that what you've always wanted, a quiet life with pretty plants?" He gestured vaguely toward her hands. "You don't need the penthouse. You'd probably replace the marble floors with soil anyway." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the small gallery. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look down. She met his gaze directly, and in that moment she saw it, the genuine belief in his eyes that she was helpless, that she would crumble under pressure, that her worth was tied to his generosity. "Your Honor," Elena said softly, rising at last, "my client isn't seeking excessive assets. She's seeking fairness. During this marriage, she provided emotional labor, household management, and unwavering support during Mr. Silva's professional setbacks, including his 2019 bankruptcy, when she sold her own inheritance to keep his business afloat. She placed a single document on the bench. We request temporary use of the penthouse, where she has resided for 8 years, and equitable access to joint accounts for living expenses during proceedings." Ricardo's smirk vanished. She sold what he snapped, turning to Croft. She had no inheritance. Her parents were teachers. Elena didn't correct him. She simply returned to her seat, her expression unreadable. Clara understood then. This was strategy. Not revealing everything at once. Letting Ricardo hang himself with his own assumptions. The judge studied the document, then looked between them. "Mr. Silva, is it true your wife supported you financially during your business difficulties?" Ricardo shifted uncomfortably. "A small loan, which I repaid immediately upon securing Series B funding." "From whom did she obtain this loan?" the judge pressed. My grandmother's jewelry," Clara said quietly. "A single pearl necklace, worth perhaps $5,000. She met Ricardo's eyes again, letting him see the truth there. The sacrifice he'd forgotten, the love he'd dismissed as irrelevant. "You cried when I sold it, Ricardo. You held my hands and promised you'd spend your life making it up to me." For a fractured second, something flickered in his eyes. Not remorse, but the ghost of the man he'd been. Then it vanished, replaced by defensive irritation. Sentimentality doesn't constitute financial contribution, Your Honor. She chose to sell it. I didn't ask her to. The judge's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Marriage is built on choices made together, Mr. Silva. Not transactional bookkeeping. She turned to Elena. Motion granted for temporary penthouse occupancy and joint account access. Final asset division will be determined at trial. As the bailiff called the next case, Ricardo shot to his feet, his composure cracking. This is absurd. She'll destroy the penthouse with her herbs and stones, Ricardo. Clara's voice cut through the courtroom, soft but carrying. She stood slowly, her hands resting lightly on the table. You gave me stones because you thought I was worthless. But stones endure. They outlast diamonds when the pressure fades. She paused, letting the words settle. You'll learn that soon enough. She turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. But halfway to the doors, she stopped and faced him one last time. Not with anger, not with tears, but with a sorrow so profound it stilled the entire room. I loved you when you were nothing but ambition and anxiety, she said, her voice barely above a whisper yet reaching every corner of the silent courtroom. I loved the boy who cried over failed pitches and believed in olive trees more than stock options. I didn't leave because you gave diamonds to another woman. I left because you became someone who thinks diamonds matter more than people. Her gaze swept over him, not with contempt, but with finality. And that man, I never knew him at all. Outside, the city air felt different, cleaner, lighter. Clara walked 3 blocks before stopping at a small park bench overlooking the river. She unwrapped the river stone from her satchel, its white vein glowing in the afternoon sun. She thought of Ricardo's face when she mentioned the pearl necklace, the flicker of memory he'd tried to suppress. He still didn't understand. He thought this was about money, about revenge, but it was about truth. Her phone buzzed, a text from Elena he's rattled. Croft just called demanding full financial disclosure. They're scared. Clara typed back, let them be scared. Truth has a way of surfacing. She didn't send it. Instead, she deleted the draft and powered off the phone. For now, silence was her greatest weapon. Let Ricardo wonder. Let him lie awake nights calculating assets he thought she didn't know about. Let him imagine worst-case scenarios while she sat by the river, feeling the sun on her skin and the weight of a stone in her palm. Both simple, both real, both hers. A young couple passed by hand in hand, laughing about burnt toast and missed trains. Clara watched them with a quiet ache, not of longing, but of recognition. Love wasn't in penthouse views or diamond necklaces. It was in burnt toast and shared laughter. In showing up, day after ordinary day. Ricardo would never understand that. And that was his tragedy, not hers. As dusk began to paint the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Clara stood and walked toward the train station. She didn't look back at the courthouse. She didn't need to. The battle had just begun, but something fundamental had shifted today. Not in the legal ruling, but in the space between them. Ricardo had shown his hand. He'd revealed the depth of his contempt. And in doing so, he'd handed her the one weapon she truly needed: clarity. On the train home, she pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching the city blur into streaks of light. In her pocket, the river stone felt warm against her thigh, a reminder that some things gain value not through polish, but through pressure, through time, through the quiet, persistent work of becoming. And as the train carried her toward the apartment she would occupy alone for the next few months, Clara Mendez, the heiress who had chosen love over legacy, finally understood she wasn't losing a husband. She was reclaiming a self. And no courtroom, no lawyer, no arrogant ex-husband could ever take that from her again. The train plunged into a tunnel, darkness swallowing the world outside. For 30 seconds, Clara sat in perfect blackness, the rhythm of the wheels a steady heartbeat beneath her. And in that darkness, she smiled, not with joy, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally stopped running from her own reflection. Ready to release the crystal vase from their first anniversary, he'd forgotten the date, bought it last minute at the airport. The abstract painting he'd insisted would appreciate in value. She'd always thought it looked like sadness smeared across canvas. The marble coffee table where he'd placed those river stones with such casual cruelty. She didn't pack them away. She simply looked at each item until its emotional charge dissolved, leaving only memory. Clean, quiet, and no longer painful. 3 days later, a letter arrived on thick cotton paper, the Verde Vida crest embossed in the corner. Abuela's handwriting, elegant and firm: My Clara, the old olive grove on the southern ridge needs your hands. The soil remembers you. Come when the moon is full. The earth. Gossip. As hope. She paused. People around here have been hurting since the fire. Seeing this land come alive again, it matters more than you know. After she left, Clara walked to the ridge's edge and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and amber. Below, the village lights twinkled like earthbound stars. For the first time since leaving Ricardo, she felt not solitude but connection to the land, to its history, to the quiet resilience of people who understood that true wealth grows slowly, rooted deep. That night, lying on a simple cot in the stone cottage, she dreamed not of diamonds or penthouse views, but of roots spreading through dark soil, of sap rising in spring, of green shoots breaking through ash. When she woke before dawn, she knew with absolute certainty this was her rebirth. Not dramatic, not vengeful, but real, like the first green shoot after fire. She rose and walked to the well, drawing a bucket of cool water. As she drank, she felt a shift in the air, not wind, but awareness. Someone was watching, not with malice, but with curiosity. She turned slowly. At the edge of the grove stood a young boy of perhaps 10, barefoot and wide-eyed, holding a bundle of wildflowers. "My abuela sent these," he said shyly, approaching and placing the flowers at her feet. Purple thistles, yellow broom, white chamomile. She says the land recognizes its caretaker. Clara knelt to his level, her heart swelling. "Thank her for me. And tell her. The land remembers kindness." As the boy ran back toward the village, Clara arranged the wildflowers in a clay pot by the cottage door. Then she picked up her spade and walked toward the next section of scorched earth. The work would be slow. The healing would take years. NCE during a visit, admiring her reflection with a hunger that made him uneasy. "It's even more stunning in person," she'd murmured, fingers tracing the teardrop stone at her throat. "When will she sign the papers? I'm tired of pretending we're just colleagues." Ricardo had poured himself a whiskey, avoiding her gaze in the mirror. "Soon. The lawyer says she's being unexpectedly cooperative." Cooperative. Vanessa turned, the diamond catching the light like a shard of ice. "What does that mean? Is she demanding more money?" "No. That's the strange part." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "She's not fighting for the penthouse. Not arguing about assets. She just left. Like none of it mattered." Vanessa's smile tightened. "Of course it mattered. She's playing a game. Women like her. They act unbothered until the settlement check clears." But Ricardo hadn't slept well since Clara's departure. He kept replaying their last conversation in the courtroom. Not her words, but the calm in her eyes. No tears. No rage. Just a sorrow so deep it felt like judgment. And the way she'd mentioned the pearl necklace he'd forgotten he'd ever cried over. That haunted him. 2 weeks after Clara left, Vanessa arrived at his office unannounced, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. She wore the diamond necklace, though it was daytime, though no one important would see it. "Cancel dinner tonight," she announced, dropping into the chair opposite his desk without invitation. "I need you to take me to Cartier tomorrow. That emerald bracelet we saw last month." Ricardo barely looked up from his screen. "I have the Henderson closing all day. Reschedule it." Her voice sharpened. "Or I'll start wondering why you're suddenly so busy when your wife is conveniently gone." He finally met her gaze, and what he saw there startled him. Not love, not even desire, but calculation. A transactional hunger that mirrored his own worst instincts back at him. "Clara didn't fight for anything," he said quietly. "Not the apartment. Not the cars. She just walked away. And I can't stop thinking about why." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Because she has nothing else. She's waiting for you to feel guilty and give her more." "No." Ricardo stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city pulse below. "It's not that. She looked at me in that courtroom like I was already gone. Like she'd already mourned me." He turned, his voice cracking. "What if she has somewhere to go? What if she's not as simple as we thought?" Simple. Vanessa laughed. A brittle, nervous sound. "She collects rocks, Ricardo. She wears linen dresses to black tie galas. She's not mysterious. She's basic." She stood and approached him, fingers trailing down his arm. "You're overthinking this. She's probably staying with some spinster aunt in a walk-up apartment, crying into her herb garden." But that night, unable to sleep, Ricardo did something he'd never done before he searched Clara's name online. Not Clara Silva, the identity he knew, but every variation. Hours passed. Nothing. Until, just before dawn, a regional Portuguese newspaper archive caught his eye a 2018 article about sustainable agriculture awards. There, In a small photograph stood a younger Clara beside an elderly woman with silver hair, accepting an award for Verde Vita's water conservation initiative. The caption identified them as Clara Mendez, heiress and lead agronomist, and Elena Mendez, company founder. Ricardo's blood ran cold. Mendez. The name echoed in his memory. Verde Vita, the agricultural giant his firm had tried to acquire 2 years ago. The board had refused all offers, citing family ownership. He dismissed them as sentimental fools. He spent the next morning making discreet calls to contacts in the agriculture sector. By noon, he had confirmation Clara Mendez was the sole heir to Verde Vita, worth hundreds of millions. Not in liquid assets, but in land, water rights, and sustainable technology patents. When Vanessa arrived that evening, he was waiting by the window, the city lights glittering behind him like scattered accusations. Change of plans, she announced, dropping her purse on the sofa. I called Cartier. They're holding the bracelet for us tomorrow. Ricardo didn't turn. Clara isn't who we thought she was. Vanessa froze mid-step. What does that mean? He faced her then, his expression stripped of its usual polish. She's Clara Mendez, heiress to Verde Vita. She hid her identity when we met. For a long moment, Vanessa simply stared. Then she laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. That's impossible. Heiresses don't live in modest apartments. They don't collect river stones. They don't let their husbands buy them pearls they can't even wear. I have proof, Ricardo said flatly. Photographs. Corporate records. She sold her grandmother's pearl necklace to bail me out during my bankruptcy. A necklace worth $50,000, Vanessa. Not 5. The color drained from Vanessa's face. She sank onto the sofa, fingers trembling as they rose to touch the diamond at her throat. A gift bought with money Clara's family's earth had helped generate. Why would she hide it? Vanessa whispered, her voice small. Ricardo finally sat beside her, the weight of revelation pressing down on his shoulders. To see if I'd love her for herself. Not her name. Not her money. He looked at Vanessa, really looked, and saw not a partner, but a reflection of his own emptiness. And I failed. Spectacularly. Vanessa's composure shattered. So what happens now? Does she get everything in the divorce? Will she take your company, your reputation? Her voice rose, edged with panic. What about me? You promised. I promised nothing, Ricardo interrupted, his voice weary. I was lonely. You were convenient. But Clara, she was real. And I threw her away for a woman who cares more about emerald bracelets than whether I slept last night. Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes, not of love, but of wounded pride. You're blaming me. You're the one who bought me diamonds while giving your wife stones. You're the one who called her moss. And you encouraged it. Ricardo shot back, standing abruptly. Every time I mentioned her garden, you rolled your eyes. Every time I said she was kind, you called her boring. You didn't want me to love her. You wanted me to need you instead. Vanessa stood, her hands clenched. Fine. Walk away. But remember this when she reveals her inheritance in court. Everyone will know you were too blind to see the woman sleeping beside you was worth more than your entire portfolio. They'll laugh at you, Ricardo. Not pity you. Laugh. She snatched her purse and strode toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. And for what it's worth, I never wanted the emerald bracelet. I wanted you to look at me the way you used to look at her, before you forgot how. The door closed softly behind her. Not a slam. A surrender. Alone in the silent penthouse, Ricardo walked to Clara's abandoned balcony garden. The herbs had wilted without her care, basil leaves brown at the edges, rosemary brittle and gray. But nestled among the dying plants, he noticed something he'd never seen before: tiny white flowers blooming on the thyme plant, delicate as stars. Clara had once told him thyme only flowers when treated with patience, never force. He sank onto the floor, the marble cold through his trousers, and pressed his forehead against the glass door. Below, the city glittered with a million diamond-like lights, each one a promise of status, of acquisition, of everything he'd mistaken for worth. And for the first time, he understood the terrible truth: Clara hadn't left because he gave diamonds to another woman. She'd left because he'd stopped seeing diamonds in her. His phone buzzed on the floor beside him. A text from his lawyer, Elena Vargas, just filed amended disclosures. Prepare yourself. Tomorrow's hearing will change everything. Ricardo didn't reply. He simply sat in the gathering dark, watching the thyme flowers glow faintly in the moonlight, a quiet beauty he'd overlooked for years. And as the first tear traced a path down his cheek, he realized with devastating clarity he wasn't crying for the fortune he might lose. He was crying for the woman he'd already lost. Indonesian partner. They've defaulted. The entire investment, $20 million, is frozen. Possibly unrecoverable. Ricardo didn't move. Didn't breathe. He simply stared at the spreadsheet glowing on Mark's screen. The red numbers bleeding across columns like wounds. 20 million. The money he'd leveraged against everything: the penthouse mortgage, his private equity stake, even the line of credit he'd used to buy Vanessa's diamond necklace. Unrecoverable. Ricardo's voice was dangerously calm. We have contracts. Arbitration clauses. I want lawyers in Jakarta by tonight. Mark shifted uncomfortably. The partner filed for bankruptcy protection an hour ago. Their assets were already pledged to 3 other creditors. We're last in line. For the first time in 15 years, Ricardo felt the floor tilt beneath him. Not metaphorically. A physical lurch in his stomach, a cold sweat prickling his scalp. He'd built his empire on calculated risks, but this wasn't calculation. This was arrogance. He'd ignored his analysts' warnings about the partner's shaky finances because Vanessa had whispered over champagne, "Real men don't let caution steal opportunity." Now caution had saved others' while. Arrogance bled him dry. That evening, sitting alone in the penthouse's cavernous silence, Ricardo stared at his phone. Clara's number glowed on the screen. Unchanged, unblocked, a ghost he could summon with one tap. He imagined her voice calm, steady, offering not judgment but practical wisdom. She'd studied economics before choosing agronomy. She'd warned him about over-leveraging during their early years together. Roots before branches, she'd said once, watching him celebrate a risky acquisition. Trees that grow too fast in shallow soil topple first. His thumb hovered over the call button. One press. One admission of failure. One chance to hear her say, "I told you so," or better yet, to offer help without conditions. But pride is a prison with walls you build yourself. He powered off the phone and poured 3 fingers of whiskey, neat, no ice. The burn in his throat felt like penance. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, blurring the city lights into watery smears of gold and crimson. He thought of Clara in that coastal village, her hands in the earth, her face turned toward sun instead of screens. She was probably planting something right now, something that would grow slowly, patiently, without demanding immediate returns. A notification flashed on his laptop screen. Email from his bank. Account alert: mortgage payment due in 7 days. Insufficient funds. Ricardo laughed, a broken, hollow sound that echoed in the empty room. He'd spent years building a life designed to be admired from the outside. Now the foundation was cracking, and no one was watching. No one cared. Vanessa had stopped answering his texts 3 days ago. His so-called friends had grown quiet since news of the Kensington collapse leaked to financial blogs. He opened a new browser tab and typed Clara's name. Not searching for scandal, searching for solace. The regional newspaper article about her restoration project appeared again. This time he read it fully. Local heiress Clara Mendez begins ecological revival of fire-scarred Olive Grove. There was a photograph, small but clear, of Clara kneeling in the soil, her linen trousers stained with earth, her face lifted toward the sun with an expression he hadn't seen in years. Peace. Not triumph. Not vengeance. Peace. His lawyer's warning echoed in his mind: tomorrow's hearing will change everything. He knew what was coming. Clara's legal team would reveal her true identity. The courtroom would learn he'd dismissed a woman worth hundreds of millions as simple, dim moss. The humiliation would be exquisite. Public. Permanent. And still, his thumb hovered over her number. "Just ask," a voice whispered inside him. The boy he'd been before ambition hardened his edges. "Just say you were wrong. Say you see her now." But the man he'd become, the one who measured love in carrots and loyalty in stock options, couldn't form the words. To ask Clara for help would be to admit she'd been right all along, that his glittering world was built on sand, while her quiet life was rooted in bedrock. And that admission would destroy what remained of his pride. He closed the laptop, walked to the balcony doors, pressed his forehead against the cool glass as rain streaked the city into abstract art. Somewhere out there, Clara was breathing air that smelled of time and wet earth. Somewhere, she was choosing life over luxury. And somewhere deep inside him, a truth he could no longer ignore took root: he hadn't lost her to another man. He'd lost her to his own blindness. And no amount of money, not even hers, could buy back what he'd thrown away. 3 days later, sitting in his lawyer's office as Croft laid out their dwindling options, Ricardo's phone buzzed. A news alert: Verde Vida heiress Clara Mendez confirms identity amid divorce proceedings. Below it, A quote from Elena Vargas, my client, has never hidden her identity. She simply chose to be loved for who she is, not what she owns. Croft groaned, rubbing his temples. This changes everything. The judge will see you as contemptuous, dismissive of her worth. Ricardo didn't answer. He was reading the article's final paragraph when asked if she plans to leverage her inheritance in divorce negotiations. Mendez declined comment. Sources close to the heiress say she intends to request only what is legally fair. Nothing more, nothing less. She's not interested in punishment, an anonymous source stated. Only in peace. Peace. The word settled in Ricardo's chest like a stone sinking in deep water. Clara wasn't coming for his blood. She wasn't even coming for his money. She was simply walking away, whole, unbroken, already healing while he was still drowning in the wreckage of his own making. That night, as creditors' calls lit up his phone like angry fireflies, Ricardo did something he hadn't done since college. He went for a walk. No driver. No destination. Just the rain-slicked streets and the weight of his own thoughts. He walked for hours, past glittering storefronts selling things he could no longer afford, past couples sharing umbrellas and laughter, past a small park where an elderly man played guitar beneath a dripping oak tree. And there, on a bench slick with rain, Ricardo finally cried. Not the performative tears of a man losing assets, but the raw, shuddering sobs of a man realizing he'd mistaken possession for love, status for substance, glitter for gold. He didn't call Clara. He didn't text. He simply sat in the rain until his suit was soaked through, until his pride dissolved like salt in water, until he understood with devastating clarity some losses aren't meant to be recovered. They're meant to be endured. And in that endurance, if you're lucky, you might just become someone worthy of what you lost. Miles away, in a stone cottage smelling of wood smoke and damp earth, Clara read the same news alert on her simple phone. She felt no triumph, no schadenfreude, only a quiet sadness for the man who'd had everything, a woman who loved him, a life of meaning, and had traded it all for diamonds that couldn't keep him warm on lonely nights. She placed her phone face down on the wooden table and returned to her work sketching plans for a rainwater catchment system that would nourish the young saplings through the dry season. Her hands moved with purpose, her heart steady. She knew Ricardo was suffering. She even pitied him. But she would not interfere. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect. His downfall was his own making. His redemption, if it came, would have to be his own doing too. And as moonlight filtered through the cottage window, illuminating the river stone resting on her windowsill, Clara understood the final truth she'd been learning all along: love doesn't mean saving people from consequences. Sometimes love declined. What more was there to say, but Elena insisted, let him see you one last time, Clara. Not as his victim. Not as his heiress. Just as yourself. Now she sat at a corner table in the Willow, a cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop, its windows fogged with the gentle steam of espresso machines. Morning light filtered through hanging ivy, casting dappled shadows across the worn wooden table. Clara wore the same linen trousers she'd left the penthouse in, but they looked different now, softer, as if the earth itself had blessed them. Her hands rested calmly around a mug of chamomile tea, the river stone from her pocket pressed between her thumb and forefinger beneath the table, a secret anchor. The bell above the door chimed. Ricardo stood frozen in the doorway, rain-damp and unshaven, his expensive coat hanging loose on shoulders that seemed to have collapsed inward. He'd lost weight. The sharp angles of his face had softened into something haunted. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, not with anger or calculation, but with a raw, unguarded recognition that made Clara's breath catch. You came, he said, his voice rougher than she remembered. I almost didn't, she admitted, gesturing to the empty chair. Sit, Ricardo. The tea is still hot. He lowered himself carefully, as if his bones had grown fragile overnight. His eyes traveled over her face, not lingering on imagined flaws, but tracing the quiet peace in her features, the absence of the tension that had once lived between her brows. You look different, he murmured. I feel different, she said softly. The land heals you when you let it. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with all the words they'd never spoken. Ricardo's hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the teacup she'd poured for him. He didn't drink, just held its warmth like a lifeline. I read the article, he said finally, about the olive grove, about who you are. Clara nodded. I never lied to you, Ricardo. I just didn't lead with it. I wanted to be loved for my hands in the soil, not my name on a deed. I know. His voice cracked. And I failed you. Not because of Vanessa. Because I stopped seeing you at all. He looked down at his hands. Once so confident signing million-dollar deals, now uncertain how to hold a simple teacup. I called you Moss. I said you had no sparkle. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she didn't look away. That hurt more than the affair, she whispered. Because it wasn't true. And you knew it wasn't true. You just chose to believe the lie because it made you feel superior. Ricardo flinched as if struck. I was afraid, he admitted, the words raw and unfamiliar on his tongue. Afraid that if I acknowledged your strength, I'd have to admit my own weakness. That I needed you, not your money, not your status, but you, to feel whole. Outside, rain began to fall against the cafe windows, softening the world beyond into watercolor. Inside, the air thickened with unshed tears and truths too long buried. Do you remember our first picnic? Clara asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. By the creek where I found that quartz-veined stone, I gave you. Ricardo's eyes closed. You packed sandwiches with herbs from your windowsill garden. I dropped my phone in the water, reaching for a wildflower to give you. A faint, broken smile touched his lips. You laughed until you cried. Said I'd traded technology for beauty. I still have that stone, Clara said. The one you called my good luck charm during your first investor pitch. She reached into her satchel and placed it gently on the table between them. The same gray stone with its delicate white vein, now smoothed further by time and touch. You threw it in a drawer after we moved to the penthouse. Said it was too rustic for the new aesthetic. Ricardo picked it up with trembling fingers, turning it over as if seeing it for the first time. I forgot, he whispered. God, Clara, I forgot so much. You forgot that love isn't about matching aesthetics, she said, her voice gaining strength. It's about honoring what the other person finds beautiful. You gave me stones from a jeweler's case while buying diamonds for your mistress. Not because you thought I deserved less, but because you'd stopped believing I deserved anything at all. Ricardo's composure shattered. A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. I'm so sorry, he choked out, the words ragged with genuine remorse. Not for the divorce. For the contempt. For looking at the woman who sold her grandmother's pearls to save me and seeing Moss. Clara reached across the table then, not to touch him, but to rest her hand palm up beside the stone. An invitation. Not for reconciliation, but for witness. I'm not angry anymore, she said, her voice steady as deep water. Anger requires energy I'm choosing to give to olive saplings and wildflowers. But I needed you to know this: my worth was never in your hands, Ricardo. It was never in diamonds or stones or penthouse views. It was always here. She pressed her palm gently against her own chest. And you never had the power to diminish it. You only had the privilege of recognizing it. And you chose not to. Ricardo stared at her hand, then at the stone in his own, then finally into her eyes. Really looked, perhaps for the first time in years. And what he saw there wasn't triumph or vengeance. It was peace. A peace he'd spent his life chasing in boardrooms and bank accounts, only to discover it had been sitting beside him all along in a woman who found magic in river stones and healing in soil. I don't expect forgiveness, he said quietly. I don't deserve it. But I needed to see you one last time. To remember who I lost. Clara nodded slowly. Then remember this too: the woman you married wasn't hiding her inheritance. She was offering you a choice, to love her for herself. And you chose the glitter instead. She slid the divorce documents toward him, her signature already in place. Sign these. Walk away. And one day, if you're lucky, you'll learn to see beauty in what doesn't sparkle. Ricardo signed without reading the terms. His hand didn't shake. When he finished, he placed the pen down carefully and looked at her. Not with desire, not with regret, but with something quieter and more profound reverence. I'll never forget you, he said. Clara stood, gathering her satchel. Don't forget the lesson, she corrected gently. Forget me if you must. But remember that real wealth isn't counted in carats. It's measured in the courage to be seen, and the humility to see others. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Rain fell softly beyond the glass, washing the streets clean. Ricardo, she said without turning. The time on our balcony, it flowered last week. Tiny white stars. You always said it was stubborn. But time only flowers when treated with patience, never force. She finally looked back, her eyes holding his with infinite tenderness. Some things are worth waiting for, even when they don't glitter. The bell chimed again as she stepped into the rain. Ricardo remained at the table long after she'd gone, the river stone still warm in his palm. the ghost of her presence lingering like the scent of chamomile and wet earth. Outside, the city continued its frantic dance of acquisition and display. But inside that quiet cafe, a man who had spent his life chasing diamonds finally understood the unbearable weight of what he'd discarded, a love as steady and enduring as stone itself. And a wife everyone had dismissed as unremarkable. They expected tears. They expected drama. They expected a modest settlement signed with trembling hands. They did not expect Clara. She arrived alone, without fanfare, dressed not in designer armor, but in the same sun-bleached linen trousers and simple cotton blouse she'd worn to the cafe. But something had shifted in her carriage. The slight hesitation in her step had vanished, replaced by a grounded certainty that made the marble floors seem to steady beneath her feet. In her hand, she carried not a leather briefcase, but a worn wooden box the color of honeyed oak, its surface smoothed by generations of hands. Ricardo sat at the opposing table already, flanked by Croft and 2 junior associates. He looked thinner, his suit hanging loosely on shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the collapsing world he'd built. When he saw Clara, his breath caught audibly. Not because of her appearance, though the peace in her face was a stark contrast to the tension etching his own, but because of the box in her hands. He'd never seen it before, and in that unfamiliar object, he sensed the approach of a truth he wasn't ready to face. "Order," the judge intoned, her gaze sweeping the room. "This court will now hear final arguments regarding asset division in the matter of Silva versus Silva. Mr. Croft, you may proceed." Croft rose, adjusting his tie with practiced flourish. "Your Honor, as previously established, my client was the sole financial provider during this marriage. Mrs. Silva possesses no independent assets of significance, no career history that would generate substantial income, and frankly," he glanced at Clara with condescending pity, "has demonstrated a preference for simple, rustic living that hardly justifies a disproportionate share of marital assets." Ricardo kept his eyes fixed on the table, unable to look at Clara. He'd spent the night rehearsing apologies in his mind, scenarios where he'd beg her to reconsider, to take pity on the wreckage of his life. But now, facing her quiet presence, the words dissolved like salt in water. "Mrs. Vargas," the judge said gently. "Your response." Elena stood slowly, her silver hair catching the courtroom light like a crown. "Your Honor, my client does not seek an inequitable division of marital assets. She seeks only what is legally fair. However," she turned toward Clara, "before we proceed, Mrs. Mendez has requested permission to present documentation regarding her premarital assets, information deliberately withheld during earlier proceedings to avoid unnecessary complication." A ripple moved through the gallery. "Mendez." The name landed like a stone in still water. Ricardo's head snapped up. "Clara Silva," he corrected sharply, his voice cracking. "Her name is Clara Silva." Clara finally looked at him. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with a sorrow so profound it stilled the entire room. "No, Ricardo," she said softly. "My name has always been Clara Mendez. Heiress to Verde Vida Agricola." The judge leaned forward, her pen pausing above her notepad. "Mrs. Mendez, are you stating under oath that you concealed your identity during your marriage?" "I concealed nothing," Clara corrected gently. "I simply chose not to lead with it. I wanted to be loved for myself, not my inheritance." She placed the wooden box on the table and lifted its lid with reverence. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay not jewelry or cash, but documents, yellowed land deeds from 1923, notarized wills bearing her family's seal, stock certificates for Verde Vida's controlling shares. On top rested a single photograph, Clara as a girl of 10, barefoot in an olive grove, dirt on her knees and sun in her hair, her grandmother's hand resting on her shoulder. "This," Clara said, her voice gaining strength as she lifted the top document, "is the deed to the Southern Ridge property I've been restoring. 500 acres of ancient olive groves, water rights to 3 aquifers, and patents for sustainable irrigation technology that will become invaluable as droughts intensify." She placed it before the judge. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations. Its value isn't in resale potential, it's in legacy, in feeding communities, in healing earth." She turned to Ricardo then, her gaze steady. "You gave me stones from a jeweler's case because you thought I was poor. But these," she opened her palm to reveal the river stone she'd carried since the night he'd given it to her. "These stones came from my own land, from the creek that runs through Verde Vida property, the very earth that has sustained my family for a century." Ricardo stared at the stone in her hand as if seeing it for the first time. Not as an insult, but as a key. The white vein running through its gray surface suddenly made sense: quartz deposits unique to Verde Vita's southern ridge. He'd held a piece of her inheritance in contempt while buying diamonds for a woman who saw him only as a wallet. I sold my grandmother's pearl necklace to save your first company, Clara continued, her voice softening with remembered pain. Not because I had to, because I believed in you. And you repaid that faith by calling me Moss. By believing my worth could be measured in carats rather than character. Croft sputtered, flipping through files. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. These documents were never disclosed in discovery. They weren't hidden, Elena interrupted calmly. They were irrelevant until Mr. Silva's contempt made them necessary. My client didn't marry for money. She married for love. And when that love was replaced with contempt, she chose dignity over deception. The judge studied Clara for a long moment. The calm in her eyes, the absence of theatricality, the simple wooden box that held more legacy than all Ricardo's assets combined. Then she turned to Ricardo. Mr. Silva, she said, her voice measured but firm. Did you know your wife's true identity during your marriage? Ricardo's throat worked soundlessly. He looked at Clara, at the woman who had cooked his meals, held him through failures, collected stones he'd mocked, and saw not a victim or a villain, but a queen who had walked among commoners by choice. The truth crashed over him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't lost a wife. He had failed to recognize a kingdom. No, he whispered, the word barely audible. I never knew. Did you, at any point, treat her with contempt because you believed her to be without means? Tears welled in Ricardo's eyes. Not of self-pity, but of devastating clarity. Yes, he choked out. I called her simple. I said she had no sparkle. I gave her stones while buying diamonds for. He couldn't finish. The shame was too absolute. The judge nodded slowly, then turned to Clara. Mrs. Mendez, what do you seek from this court? Clara stood, the river stone warm in her palm. I seek no vengeance. I seek no excessive share of marital assets. I ask only for what is legally fair, and for the right to walk away with my dignity intact. She looked at Ricardo one last time, her eyes holding not hatred, but a profound, unbreakable peace. I also ask that he understand this: the stones he gave me weren't an insult. They were a mirror. They showed him exactly who he'd become, a man who valued glitter over grit. And in that reflection, I finally saw who I truly am. She turned to the judge. I am Clara Mendez, heiress not to diamonds, but to earth itself. And no man's contempt can ever diminish that truth again. As bailiffs moved to clear the courtroom, Ricardo remained frozen in his chair, the wooden box of documents before him like an open tomb. He reached out trembling fingers and touched the photograph of Clara as a girl, barefoot, sunlit, utterly free. And in that moment, he understood the terrible, beautiful truth: he hadn't lost a wife to another man. He had lost a queen because he'd been too blind to see her crown. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed like artificial lightning. But Clara walked through them without flinching, her linen wound. The judge's gavel had fallen minutes ago, finalizing a settlement so modest it barely covered legal fees, but he hadn't moved. Couldn't move. The world had tilted on its axis, and gravity itself felt unfamiliar. Across the city, Vanessa sat in a sleek downtown cafe, scrolling through financial news on her tablet when a headline stopped her cold. Silva divorce bombshell, wife revealed as Verde Vita heiress. Her fingers trembled as she tapped the article. There, in crisp black and white, was Clara. Not the timid herb collector Ricardo had described, but a woman standing knee-deep in sun-drenched olive groves, her hands cradling soil with the reverence of a priestess. And beneath her photograph, the devastating detail: Mendez family holdings include mineral-rich lands in southern region, known for unique quartz-veined granite deposits. Vanessa's breath caught. Quartz-veined granite. The exact description of the worthless river stones Ricardo had mocked Clara for collecting. The very stones he'd tossed onto the kitchen counter with that condescending smirk: for your garden project, Moss. Her phone rang, a blocked number. She answered on instinct. Did you see it? Ricardo's voice was hollow, stripped of all polish. The stones. Vanessa, the stones were from her land. From Verde Vita property. I gave her pieces of her own inheritance while buying you diamonds mined from God knows where. Vanessa couldn't speak. She stared at the diamond necklace resting on the cafe table, a gift she'd worn with pride just yesterday. Now it felt like a brand, a mark of complicity. I'm coming over, she whispered, already gathering her things. 40 minutes later, She stood in Ricardo's penthouse doorway, the diamond necklace still around her throat like an accusation. He hadn't bothered to change from his court clothes, tie loosened, shirt rumpled, eyes red-rimmed and raw. "Take it off," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Please." Vanessa unclasped the necklace with trembling fingers, the diamond catching the afternoon light one last time before she placed it on the marble counter. It landed with a soft click that echoed through the silent apartment. "I didn't know," she whispered, tears welling. "I thought she was nothing." Ricardo finally turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't anger. It was devastation. "That's the tragedy, Vanessa. She was never nothing. I was nothing. A man so obsessed with appearing valuable that I couldn't recognize real value when it slept beside me." He walked to the balcony doors, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. "Do you know what she said when I gave her those stones? She held them like they were sacred. She said, 'They've witnessed centuries of rain. They've been shaped by forces you can't control.'" Vanessa sank onto the sofa, the truth unfolding like a slow poison in her veins. "The jeweler, when you bought them, I told him to find something rustic, unpolished, nothing flashy," Ricardo admitted, his voice cracking. "I wanted to give her what I thought she deserved. What I thought she was." He turned, tears streaming freely now. "But I was wrong. So catastrophically wrong. Those stones weren't beneath her, they were of her. Pieces of the earth her family has stewarded for generations. And I treated them like trash." He walked to a drawer and pulled out a small velvet pouch, the one Clara had left behind. With shaking hands, he spilled its contents onto the counter 5 river stones, each unique. One with a delicate white quartz vein. Another speckled with flecks of mica that caught the light like distant stars. A third, dark basalt worn smooth by centuries of water. Vanessa reached for the quartz-veined stone, turning it over in her palm. This is from the Southern Ridge," she murmured, remembering a Verde Vita sustainability report she'd skimmed during due diligence on Ricardo's failed acquisition attempt. The article said these deposits are geologically unique to that property. Worthless as gems, but invaluable as soil indicators for sustainable farming. Ricardo let out a broken laugh. "Worthless as gems. That's what I thought. That's what we both thought." He picked up the mica-flecked stone, his thumb tracing its surface. "She tried to tell me once. When I complained about her rock collection, she said, 'This one holds water in its crystalline structure. During droughts, it releases moisture slowly, like a promise kept.'" His voice dropped to a whisper. I laughed. I actually laughed and said, "Only you would find romance in dirt." Vanessa's tears fell freely now. Not for Ricardo, not for herself, but for the profound blindness they'd both shared. "I pressured you," she admitted, the confession raw and painful. "Every time you mentioned her garden, I'd roll my eyes. Every time you said she was kind, I'd call her boring. I wanted you to need me more than you loved her." She looked at the stones scattered across the marble, a silent testament to everything they'd dismissed. "We weren't just cruel. We were ignorant. And ignorance is its own kind of violence." Ricardo gathered the stones carefully, placing them back in the velvet pouch with a tenderness that made Vanessa's heart ache. "She's not coming back," he said, not as a question, but as a fact settling into his bones. "And she shouldn't. How do you come back from being called moss by the person who was supposed to see your forest?" Vanessa stood to leave, but paused at the door. "What will you do?" Ricardo walked to the balcony and looked down at the city. The glittering towers, the frantic traffic, the endless pursuit of more. "I'm going to sell everything," he said. Quietly. "The penthouse. The company shares. Even this view." He turned, his eyes clear for the first time in weeks. "I'm going to buy a small plot of land somewhere quiet. And I'm going to learn how to grow something that doesn't have a price tag." Vanessa nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her own heart. "I'm returning the diamond," she said. "And I'm enrolling in that agricultural economics program I dropped out of years ago." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Turns out some things are worth more than glitter." After she left, Ricardo remained on the balcony as dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and rose. He unclasped the velvet pouch and poured the stones into his palm. In the fading light, the quartz vein in the largest stone glowed with an inner luminescence. Not the cold fire of diamonds, but the warm, patient light of earth itself. He remembered Clara's words from their final meeting at the cafe: "Time only flowers when treated with patience, never force." And in that moment, he finally understood the terrible, beautiful truth he'd spent his life avoiding. Real value isn't created, it's recognized. and he had failed to recognize the most valuable thing he'd ever possessed until it was gone. That night, as the city glittered below like a field of artificial stars, Ricardo Silva, the man who had built an empire on appearances, did something he hadn't done since childhood. He held a stone to his ear and listened. Not for sound, but for meaning. And in the silence between heartbeats, he heard it. The slow, patient whisper of centuries, of rain on stone, of roots reaching deep into darkness to find light. The language of endurance. The grammar of grace. MPH, but with a quiet exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. Outside, the restored grove whispered in the evening breeze. A symphony of rustling leaves and distant crickets that felt more like home than any penthouse ever had. Her phone buzzed on the wooden table. A text from Elena: the judge sealed the courtroom after your statement. Ricardo didn't speak for 10 minutes. When he finally stood, he gathered those stones you left behind like they were holy relics. Clara set the phone aside without replying. She wasn't interested in his remorse. Not yet. Some wounds needed time to breathe before healing could begin. Instead, she opened a leather-bound journal. Its pages filled not with dates or appointments, but with pressed wildflowers, sketches of root systems, and fragments of poetry about earth and endurance. Tonight, she dipped her pen in ink and began to write. Not for anyone else, but for the woman she'd been 8 years ago, standing at that farmer's market with rosemary in her basket and hope in her heart. He asked me today why I chose simplicity, she wrote, her hand moving steadily across the page. Not in court, his lawyer did that, but in his eyes, in the way he looked at my linen clothes and calloused hands, as if they were costumes rather than choices. So I answered the question he never voiced. You see these stones, I told the courtroom, my voice carrying not with volume but with conviction, and you see rocks. But my grandmother taught me to see ancestors. This quartz vein, I held up the stone with the white streak. It formed when continents collided millions of years ago, a violence that created beauty. My family has farmed this land through wars, droughts, revolutions. We learned early that glitter fades, but bedrock remains. I turned to Ricardo then, not with anger, but with sorrow so deep it felt like love's ghost. You gave me these stones thinking they were worthless. But they were pieces of my inheritance, the very earth that taught me patience, resilience, the quiet dignity of growing things that feed people rather than impress them. My gaze swept the courtroom, meeting the eyes of reporters who'd come for scandal, but were witnessing something far more rare: truth. And the diamonds you gave your mistress, they're beautiful, yes. But they're carbon forced into brilliance under pressure, violence disguised as value. My stones, they were shaped by water, by time, by gentle, persistent forces that ask nothing but give everything. A silence fell so profound I could hear the judge's pen hovering above her notepad. Then I spoke the words that would haunt him longer than any legal judgment. I chose simplicity not because I lacked options, but because I understood what truly matters. Diamonds are owned. Stones are witnessed. And love, real love, should never be confused with possession. Clara set down her pen, the candle flame dancing across the page. Outside, a soft knock sounded at the cottage door. She opened it to find Manuel standing in the moonlight, his gnarled hands holding a small clay pot. The first olive sapling has set fruit, he said in Portuguese, his voice rough with emotion. Just one tiny olive. But it's enough to prove the roots took. Clara accepted the pot with trembling hands. There, nestled among silver-green leaves, hung a single olive no larger than her thumbnail, perfect, unblemished, glowing in the moonlight like a secret promise. He'll come here, Manuel said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. The husband. Men like him always return to the source when their rivers run dry. Clara shook her head gently. I don't want him to come, Manuel. Not for reconciliation. But if he does, I hope he comes not for me, but for himself. To learn that some things can't be bought, only grown. She carried the potted sapling to the windowsill, placing it beside her river stones. Moonlight poured through the glass, illuminating the tiny olive until it